Today we are ranking every weapon in Apex Legends Season 18. The meta has slightly shifted this season with some surprising newcomers to the top and bottom. Let's get to it. There are no F tier weapons, which are those for me that are absolutely just unusable. So we do begin with the D tier of give me anything else, please. And we do have the P2020 on the bottom. To the surprise of absolutely no one, the P20 still remains the gun you really are never looking for, and it is just a transfer weapon, meaning its best perk is holding the attachments for your future light ammo weapons. I think a P20 with hammer points can function a little higher, maybe like a soft C tier, but even then, there are so many better options. If you do want the one thing the P20 is good for, it's going to be that it does have a good total damage per mag, but again, it's just pretty unusable, and the time to kill is really nothing great. C tier is going to be the weapons that are really just not great. We do have one weapon, the Devotion. The Devotion used to be one of the best guns in the game, but nerfs over the seasons have put it in an odd spot. The Devotion has little to no range, making it more like a close range SMG, but when you are at this range, its handling is poor because it is an LMG. The Devotion also requires an insane amount of attachments to be viable, and you will need a large bag and all that energy ammo in the world to really make it work. If you can't get this thing fully kitted, I think it's probably like a B+ weapon, but for the majority of the time, there's just so many better close range and mid-range options that make way more sense. We have a singular gun edging towards the B tier at C+, and it is everyone's favorite troll weapon, the Beak. The Mozam is in the crafter for the first half of Season 18, which basically means you will never see one. So why am I putting it in C+ tier? Well, if you do want to craft it, the gun is still not that bad. It does a good amount of damage to the body, and you can unload the 6 shots quite fast. It also comes pre-packed in the crafter with hammer points, which is pretty cool. However, all the other shotguns are better in raw total damage, and you would be much better with any of them. The only thing that the Mozam does have going for it over the others is actually going to be its insane range, as you can get a full hit up to about 45 or so meters away. We are now moving into the weapons that are good, fine, and okay at B. These weapons can also sometimes be viable depending on the scenario or the range to your target. The first is the longbow. The longbow once was one of my favorite sniper rifles, and it actually was insane back in the Season 1 and Season 2 days, but long gone are those days. The longbow has one thing going for it, and it is going to be its ease of use. It has pretty much no recoil, and it's pretty easy to aim this thing, but it does lack bullet velocity, meaning it's going to be a little bit of a struggle to hit enemies at very long range, which is the purpose of a sniper, and this makes it a very confusing choice. Sniper ammo also is not that common, which can be troublesome. On a side note, I actually like using the longbow in close range, iron-sighted and pushing everyone. It's pretty fun. I would try it out. Backing this up is the biggest weapon adjustment for Season 18, and it is the charge rifle. It was pretty hard to rank this gun, as it does more damage than it previously did if you are shooting at the very long ranges, but wow, is the charge rifle now an extremely difficult gun to use. Even before the charge was very hard to use in the close range, but now the charge up feature to hold before firing makes it even harder, making it really lose all viability in the close to mid range. I do still think the charge is one of the best long range damage farming weapons, but you have to play much more reserved than its previous version. I think a big perk for the new charge rifle is its overall feel. It feels a little bit more traditional when you are using it, when it comes to everything, at least outside of actually firing it. It takes magazines, reloads quicker, ammo consumption is a little bit better. I think there's room for this gun to go up on my list, so don't sleep on it. It can be a great ranked contender as well, but again, it is incredibly difficult to use. If enemies are very far and have any sort of movement, you really are just hoping that they stop in that spot where the bullet does go. There's a few weapons at that borderline A tier of great and viable at B+, and the first is going to be the RE45. I find that the RE almost has a cult-like following where those who love this gun cannot speak fondly enough about it. I am not one of them though. When it comes to weapons, I look at numbers, range, damage per mag, bullet velocity, and the total DPS it can dish out, all of which the RE45 lacks substantially when compared to basically all the SMGs. And while the RE feels like it shoots fast, it really isn't that incredible when you do compare it to something like an R9. And if you are comparing it to something like a Volt or an alternator, you're not going to have that same range or the damage per mag. The RE45 is definitely not terrible, and the biggest thing going for it is its handling. It has a very quick draw speed and strafing speed, and this is even more so now that SMGs were nerfed in speed and strafing speed. If you can't get hammers and a good mag on it, I'd use it, but just know there are still going to be better options when it does come to pure TTK. Following the RE is the EVA 8 shotgun. The EVA 8 feels very odd right now, seeing as the PK and the Mastiff both had buffs direct directly and indirectly. I don't think the EVA 8 is bad by any means, as it is one of the best guns to dish out a huge amount of damage if you are diving in head first, but when it comes to the ability for the gun to work as a secondary that you can swap to and one tap someone down, it doesn't really do this that great. The only use case for the EVA, in my opinion, is multi-team fighting, where you are more or less just holding down that trigger as people run straight at you. Our final B+ gun is the G7 Scout. I debated heavily between the B+ and A for the G7, but I decided to drop the G7 down a tier simply due to the amount of other great options there are above it. Plus, I don't think the G7 has the same amount of pure power and damage as the other options, but if you do want what is probably the easiest, best weapon for poking players and farming up some damage, I think the G7 Scout is a great starting point for those who are less skilled. It should be slightly easier to find light ammo and the right attachments this season, since the Nemesis is in the crafter for the first half, meaning the 301 and the Spitfire are going to be a little bit more prevalent, and in turn, so will the amount of ammo and attachments and death boxes. As we move on to the upper tier weapons, be sure to drop a comment down below with what guns you think are the best this season. Plus, leave a like. It's free and you'll most definitely increase your chances at getting an heirloom. There are an actual crazy amount of weapons we have packed in the A tier this season, which are those that are great and viable. This kind of just shows how balanced Apex can be and how viable really most guns in the game are, and it more so depends on the player than the weapon. The Volt SMG is the first up, and while the Volt isn't as good as it was a few seasons ago or maybe a year ago, the Volt is still being a little slept on, I think. It does not have a competitive time to kill when you are going up against the car or an R99, but outside of this, it really will be quite dominant in the close range. It has a lot going for it, but mainly it's going to be its ease of use. The recoil is almost non-existent and it's very controllable. I love throwing a 2x on it so I can extend my range a little bit even further. I think the Volt is probably the gun to use if you are struggling a little bit with weapon control and you can't handle the R9 or the car, but you still want a chance at being competitive. I personally like using this gun because it makes the game very easy to approach, as I can just focus on my game sense, where to go, how to play, and not really have to worry about whiffing shots. A gun that performs very similar to the Volt is going to be the Alternator, which also slides up my list to A tier. I think the Alternator with disruptor rounds is probably more like an A+ weapon, but without, it's more like B+, thus the middle of the road ranking. I had higher hopes for the Alternator with disruptor rounds, and while it's definitely not bad, it still is not as competitive in the TTK as something like an R9. I think the Alternator works for a hybrid player looking to forego something like an R301 in favor of that close range benefits of an SMG. The Alternator is also a breeze to use, and I think much like the Volt, if you are struggling with gun control, this is a pretty good choice. Also, a quick mention that the Alternator off drop is actually kind of OP, as it has a great damage per mag even without any attachments. One of the better, or at least misunderstood weapons is the Havoc. The Havoc was better prior to the nerf to the turbocharger from way back, but the Havoc still is an insane assault rifle that if you are using it more like an SMG, you can have wild success. A level 3 mag Havoc has the potential to dish out just so much damage, which does make it a great hybrid gun. SMGs also just cannot compete with the total damage per mag, so if you are facing 2 or 3 players at once, the Havoc is going to be so healthy for you to have. The big problem with the Havoc is that without a turbo, it has a very unnatural playstyle, and if you do have a turbo, the TTK is being reduced, which does make it difficult to compete with something like an R9 or a car if you are going heads up with them. Switching gears back to longer range weapons, we have the Sentinel sniper rifle also locking in a solid A tier placement. The Sentinel is the gun to use if you want some big shots at massive damage. The charge up feature is kind of a must use for the most effectiveness, but I find the Sentinel almost works better if you treat it like a close range marksman gun, where you open with that 80 damage to the body or 120 plus headshot, and then you do push in. The Sentinel also has a surprising amount of close range viability to hip fire, and in some ways it's kind of like a slug shotgun. Not to mention, the Sentinel is one of the most satisfying guns to use. There's something about getting those big hits on enemies and its bold action that really kind of just makes me feel like I'm playing an old school Call of Duty game. In the same vein as the Sentinel, but almost in a more casual or at least easier way, the Triple Take is also a very good hybrid close to mid-range gun or even longer range weapon. For starters, the Triple Take is a brainlessly easy gun to shoot at mid-range due to the 3 pellet spread. This means every time you do connect at least 1/3 of that spread, you are going to force an enemy to shield cell, slowing them down, and thus you're going to be able to apply pressure pretty regularly. I don't think the Triple Take has the same speed per se as the G7 to do damage, or maybe the same precision as a Sentinel, but it is the easiness of the gun that is so attractive. It also can work like a mini EVA 8 in the mega close range if you are in a pinch. The final straight A tier gun is going to be the Rampage LMG, returning to the floor after being in the crafter last season. There's a lot to unpack with the Rampage, but the biggest factor that works in favor of this gun is its ability ability to conserve ammo while really not compromising on the total damage per mag that you can do. It's going to be the slower fire rate in combination with it being an LMG that does make this happen. I almost feel like the Rampage is a just more versatile G7, as you can spray it at enemies and of course charge it up to increase its viability in the close range or breach through a door. The Rampage isn't the most competitive gun in the TTK, so you can't just push enemies thinking they are just going to fall over, but you should use it more like a utility weapon that is pretty flexible. Because of all of this, I still think it's one of the better ranked guns that you can pick up. Last season I ranked the L-Star in S tier or maybe even God tier, but I decided to drop it down more or less a half tier or a full tier to the A+ weapon that it is today. The main reason is that the L-Star does have a good amount of recoil, and I don't think it's as effective as a mid-range beamer as say like the Flatline, the Hemlock, or the Nemesis. But that aside, the L-Star has so much viability to just mow enemies over if you are at that perfect range. Being able to chunk through multiple enemies at once also just exponentially makes the time to kill way better. I find the total reserve ammo in the care package version to be pretty fair, but if you do get it very early on in a game, you're probably going to have an issue at the end game where you're going to have to swap weapons, and this could be a problem for you. Since we are on the topic of care package guns, I am going to put both the Bocek and the Kraber also in that A+ territory. The Bocek is actually nuts at just applying pressure, but the limited amount of ammo makes it hard to recommend grabbing. As for the Kraber, it's always been insane, and until it has that guaranteed headshot factor to one-shot someone, I am going to be keeping it at A+. The Kraber is still just so good to apply pressure in open fights, as really anyone taking a body hit of 140 is going to be out of commission for at least 10 seconds, as they are going to have to pop a battery, a medkit, and or a Phoenix kit. This power does come with the trade-off of limited ammo and the need to swap guns eventually, but if you do get it right at the end game, it can be pretty awesome to finish up a match. Getting away from the longer range weapons, we now have the Mastiff also locking in and returning to the A+ ranking. The pellet spread buff and compaction to the Mastiff has made it considerably more viable to hit decent sized shots on enemies at range. The Mastiff has always been such a great gun to apply pressure at a more consistent rate, as you can reload singular shots at a time, and it's probably the gun that you want to have in the secondary if you are fighting a lot of one-on-ones and you do need to save that bag space. I don't think you will be able to compete in a one-on-one with an SMG, but if you are running an SMG and a Mastiff, I find that this combo can work very well if you are pubbing. The Wingman is so close to being that S tier gun, but for me, the overall ability to deal damage and have a great time to kill is slightly outmatched by others. Also, if you miss literally one bullet with the Wingman in a spray, you are dramatically reducing your ability to compete with enemies, and especially this is true if you don't have a magazine. There are times where the Wingman is almost a more viable secondary shotgun, as you can hip fire it like one, but you also have that close to mid-range, long-range tapping possibility, which is pretty cool. The Wingy is going to be the most nostalgic gun in Apex, and if you are looking to push your skills to the max, then I do think this is a good option. I also think the Wingman is a great option right off the drop. 6 rounds and you are just ready to go pretty much instantly. Next up is the R301, also at A+. I have slipped the R301 down simply because it just does not have the same firepower that it used to. However, and much like a few other guns on my list, the R301 is the gun to use if you want the most typical assault rifle experience. There isn't going to be anything easier than this gun when it does come to ARs. So if you are new or still learning the ropes, I think the 301 is something that everyone should be looking at. Also, if you do find it on the ground and you're desperate for a mid-range gun, it's not going to do you bad. I do find that the 301 struggles a little bit off the drop, and you really need that blue mag to make it work. And while it does sound like I am speaking a little negatively about the 301, it's still an A+ gun. You really can't go wrong with it. Capping out the A tier is going to be what I think the second biggest buffed or changed weapon this season is, and it is the Spitfire LMG. There's so much to fear with this gun, and it does give me Season 9 vibes when everyone was using this and abusing it. While the damage profile has had no change, the recoil and control of this gun is just so much easier, making it way more viable at range and a really great option to apply pressure. The buff to the hipfire, however, is really where things get a lot more viable, and it makes this gun much better if you do need to push in. Previously, if you were holding someone's hand and you were firing at them, you couldn't hit a single shot, but now this thing is pretty good. It will fall slightly behind the R301 in the time to kill, but you are going to get double the amount of ammo per mag, more damage per bullet, and the slower fire rate means you are going to have way better ammo conservation. You know what does not have better ammo conservation though? Your random teammates. Never play with them. Hop into my community Discord to find others to play with, and you can also ask me any questions that you might have about Apex. Meta, amazing, and insane are some of the words I would use to describe the guns in S tier. There are actually a surprising number of guns at the top, which is pretty good. It means we have a lot of choices when it does come to what you might want to play with. The first S tier gun on my list is going to be the 33rd 30 a repeater. This may be surprising to some, but the 30 has just so much power in obvious and less obvious ways. I also thought it was important to have at least one mid to long range weapon in S tier, so we can signify that this is the gun I recommend for you to use if you do want to be that teammate who is applying pressure or farming more 4K damage games. First off though, heavy ammo is going to be easy to come by, which is great if you are looking to poke enemies all game long. The gun reloads 2 rounds at a time, which is also super underrated and very important for you to deal consistent damage without really having to reload as much as other options. And finally, the damage it does is pretty good, and you can put a skull piercer on there and get around 100 headshot, which is pretty insane for a marksman weapon. Definitely don't sleep on the 30-30. I do think it is the best mid-range beamer and the gun you want to use if you do want to farm 4,000 damage games. The first prototypical assault rifle of S tier is up, and it is the Flatline. The Flatty is honestly, I think, a little slept on these days. It's always been good, but with the R301 not being as competitive in the TTK, the Flatline has absolutely stepped in. The time to kill is nearly that of a Nemesis, but the recoil is obviously much worse and harder to control, which I think is the biggest drawback. But the damage per level 3 mag is massive. 30 rounds in a slower fire rate means way better ammo conservation, while also being able to still deal tons of damage. If I had to think of the Flatline as a combination of 2 guns, it's almost an in-the-middle option between the fire rate of the R31 and the total damage mag of the Spitfire. Some have a big hatred for this weapon, which I don't really understand, but the firing range is going to be your best friend if you are struggling with it. If you can't get decent with the Flatline, your options off the spawn and into the end game are going to be much greater. A gun I often like to run with the Flatline is the Peacekeeper shotgun. The PK has always been in the upper tiers, but the reintroduction of the Disruptor rounds, and for the first time putting it on the Peacekeeper, has netted it another S tier placement. Being able to do a huge hit to start off a battle or finish someone off with even greater damage really just means that you are going to have the best chance at finishing off that enemy when you do swap to your secondary. The Peacekeeper also, of course, needs next to no ammo to function well, and I think we will be seeing more players run the Peacekeeper with a Spitfire so they can save that bag space as the season does go on. A surprising nerf that I didn't really see coming is a nerf to the R99. Last season, this was a must-have, and while the gun is still in S tier, I think the nerf to the recoil, mag size, and the overall nerf to SMGs does make it a little less of a must-have. First though, the big struggle of the R9 is going to be the fact that the base mag has been knocked down 2 rounds, meaning you are capping out just over 200 damage to the body with no mag. This means off drop, if an enemy does get a purple armor, you literally can't miss a round, or you're not going to be able to kill the enemy without reloading. Miss more than a couple and a blue armor goes out the window as well, and if the enemy is fortified, this again becomes even a bigger factor. So off spawn, I think the car is going to be way superior, but these issues aside, if you are able to get a blue or a purple mag, the R99 is still going to be the fastest killing SMG in the game, and thus it's a no-brainer. You should be using it. Since we are on the topic of SMGs, let's now discuss the car SMG. The just mentioned nerf to the R99 does mean that the car is a little bit more viable now. The car's time to kill may be slower, but the damage per mag off pickup is 247, meaning you'll never have that problem against fortified or higher tier shields. Likewise, the flexibility a car gives with either ammo or mag type still makes it a very desirable weapon that probably is more catered to ranked, where you may need to split ammo from your teammates, or you might not have as good of loot and thus less options. The car is also a little bit more forgiving, as if you miss rounds, the slower fire rate is going to help you out a little bit here. So if you want this, I probably would look at the car. I also think that the car is a little bit more consistent in terms of its performance, and while you won't kill as fast, it's definitely still worth using. Last season, and for a care package weapon, the Hemlock felt pretty underwhelming, especially considering the Nemesis was just so readily available. And even though it was in the care package, I think the Nemesis was a little bit better. But if you fast forward to today, the Hemlock comes out of the package with some very nice buffs from what it previously was on the ground, and it has made it a very good weapon. It's a burst, so it's not going to be for everyone, but the literal burst power and damage per burst should not be slept on. A quick double burst with a headshot in there, and enemies are going to be left dazed and confused as to how they fell over so fast. The damage per mag at a purple mag is also even greater than the Nemesis today, which basically means you can farm teams a little bit more easily. Also, the slower fire rate will be nice to save ammo, as the Nemesis's fire rate I find is very conducive to you just ripping through all your ammo very fast. Definitely do not sleep on the Hemlock this season. It is incredible, and until the Nemesis does come back to the ground, the Hemlock is definitely the one to look at. Much like I do with the Legends every season, I like to have a few weapons, or Legends of course, in the God tier category of a tier that are the best of the best that you can use. The first to mention is the newly packaged Prowler. The Prowler, prior to even being care packed last season, was already a very good option. The 35 rounds that you do get in the Prowler truly make it a demon weapon that is going to be incredible when you are getting pushed by teams, as this thing can fire forever. However, also having the select fire in the mix does make it full auto and much more usable at range. The burst is still insane, but it definitely was a little bit harder to track enemies and connect full hits on enemies who were further away, in burst mode at least. If you do see this thing in a care package or in a death box, you have to pick it up, and if you do hear an enemy with it, you gotta be extremely careful when you do go fight them. While it is in the crafter for the first half of Season 18, the Nemesis still reigns supreme as the weapon to grab if you do want the best time to kill in the game for a mid-range gun. The Nemi still feels so good to use, and while burst weapons aren't going to be for everyone, I just think that you can't avoid this gun. Practice up, as the Nemesis has the complete package of DPS, damage per mag, handling, and a fairly easy recoil pattern. Check out this video right here though if you want 21 tips to improve in Apex Legends. Hit that like button, sub for more, and as always, happy gaming, Legends.